Good morning, everyone. Bon matin à tous. My name is Philip, and I'll be moderating today's press conference. Mon nom est Philippe, et je vais être modérateur pour cette conférence de presse. We're joined by Conservative MPs Michael Cooper and Tamara Jansen, as well as Canadian psychiatrists, geriatricians, and Indigenous leaders to discuss the Senate amendments to Bill C-7 and the dangers that they pose to vulnerable Canadians. On est joint par les députés Cooper et Jansen, ainsi que plusieurs psychiatres, gériatres et des leaders autochtones canadiens pour discuter des amendements pour le projet de loi C-7 et le danger que ça pose pour les Canadiens vulnérables. After a brief statement from each of our speakers, we will turn it over to the phone lines and then the room for questions. Après une courte déclaration de chacun de nos députés et nos spécialistes, on va se tourner vers les questions téléphoniques et ceux provenant de la salle. Je cède la parole à M. Cooper. Mr. Cooper, over to you.
Good morning. Michael Cooper, Member of Parliament for St. Albert, Edmonton, and a member of the Justice Committee, which studied Bill C-7. I cannot state in the strongest of terms the degree of recklessness on the part of this government to accept a radical and dangerous Senate amendment that would allow for medical assistance in dying for persons who are suffering solely from a mental illness. This radically expands Canada's medical assistance in dying regime and will with certainty put even more vulnerable Canadians at risk. As Margaret Eaton, the CEO of the Canadian Mental Health Association, stated in a media release imploring members of Parliament to reject the Senate amendment, quote, "What sets mental illness apart from all other types of suffering is that there always remains hope of recovery," end of quote. In other words, it is not possible to predict irremediability when we are talking about mental illness. And that is important because a key criteria, indeed the most important criteria for qualifying for medical assistance in dying, as set out by the Supreme Court of Canada in the Carter decision, is that one must suffer from a grievous and irremediable condition. And yet, when we're talking about mental health, it's not possible to determine. It's not possible to predict whether someone will get better or will recover. And that begs the very frightening question as to how many Canadians suffering from mental illness will prematurely end their lives as a result of this legislation. And yet, the government is moving full steam ahead, so blinded by ideology. The Attorney General, in accepting this radical Senate amendment, has made it clear that when it comes to medical assistance in dying for persons suffering solely from mental illness, it is now a fait accompli. This, despite the fact that there is a complete lack of consensus within the medical community, and despite the fact that there has been no study by Parliament on this drastic change. And to top it off, this government is seeking to ram through Bill C-7, legislation that is now substantively different than the bill that was passed in the fall and sent to the Senate, in a cynical effort to avoid parliamentary scrutiny. This on a matter that literally involves life and death, involving some of the most vulnerable persons in Canadian society. If that isn't the height of recklessness on the part of this government, then frankly, I don't know what is. And it speaks to a total and callous disregard for the rights and well-being of Canadians suffering from mental illness. Thank you. Turn it over now to my colleague, Member of Parliament Tamara Jansen, who has done exemplary work in highlighting the dangers of Bill C-7, legislation that violates international human rights norms. And I want to thank her for her leadership in organizing the esteemed panel of medical professionals and Indigenous leaders who are with us today to lend their voice in opposition to Bill C-7.
Thank you so much, Michael. Now I have the honor of introducing our distinguished panel of speakers for today's press conference. First, we will hear from our Indigenous speakers, beginning with Tyler White, CEO of the Sitka First Nations Health Services and president of the First Nations Health Consortium, among other accolades. Next, we will hear from Dr. Lana Potts. Dr. Potts is a member of the Piikani First Nation family, a physician with specialty in Indigenous health, and is a member of the Racism and Discrimination Working Group for the Federal Medical Regulatory Authorities of Canada. And finally, the Honorable Graydon Nicholas. Graydon was an attorney, judge, and politician, and was the first Indigenous Lieutenant Governor of New Brunswick, and is a member of the Wolastoqiyik Nation. We will then move to our geriatricians, starting with Dr. Catherine Ferrier, geriatric consultant in the Division of Geriatric Medicine of the McGill University of Health Center. Working in the geriatric clinic, Dr. Ferrier sees patients suffering from ailments related to aging, especially cognitive disorders. She has a special interest in assessment of decision-making capacity and has often testified in court for her patients. And then we will hear from Dr. Felix Pajot, a certified geriatrician and a fellow of the McLean Center for Clinical Medical Ethics. Dr. Pajot has participated as an active member on 3 ethics committees in Quebec. And finally, we will hear from our psychiatrists. I'm hoping we're starting with Dr. Bertrand Major from Joliette General Hospital in Quebec, but I'm not sure if he's on the line yet. And closing with Dr. Mayer, a psychiatrist with the Canadian Mental Health Association, president of the Ontario Association for ACT and FACT, and the editor-in-chief, Journal of Ethics in Mental Health. Mr. White, please take it away.
I'm here to speak on behalf of Siksika Nation, a member of the Blackfoot Confederacy and Treaty 7 in Alberta. We have grave concerns over the implications of Bill C-7, the expansion of MAID to include mental illness, and those whose death is not foreseeable will have a lasting impact on our vulnerable populations. Bill C-7 has not taken into account the existing health disparities and social inequalities we face compared to non-Indigenous people. Across the board, we have worse health outcomes, more complex diseases, and higher rates of mental illness and suicide. The consultation with Indigenous leaders about how to implement Bill C-7 in our community has been trivial. Many of us do not feel safe accessing healthcare due to stigma and racism. The fear of MAID when we face systemic discrimination and coercion in the healthcare system will only delay access to care and worsen health outcomes. It is unjust to offer Bill C-7 to our people when basic care and compassion have not been provided in the first place. To quote the original preamble for Bill C-14, vulnerable persons must be protected from being induced in moments of weakness to end their lives. We are also concerned about the impact of Bill C-7 on our efforts to combat the youth suicide crisis in our communities. It sends a wrong message to those who are not coping that the only way to improve their suffering is to choose death, encouraging those who are already in despair and thinking about suicide to act on it. Our message to our youth is that suicide is not the answer. Bill C-7 will send a message in direct opposition to ours. The United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous People states that we have a right to participate in decision-making in matters which would affect our health and well-being. It is time to recognize Indigenous communities as full partners in healthcare delivery. And we call on the Government of Canada to kill this amendment and Bill C-7. Thank you.
Next, we have Dr. Lana Potts.
Acknowledge that I meet with you on my traditional territory here in what is now known as the city of Calgary, which we call Mufkinstis. I am a Blackfoot physician from the Piikani Nation and have worked in First Nations health for the last 20 years. And I'm speaking to you from my heart and from my spirit to ask you to kill Bill C-7. I'm concerned about several areas. The first is regarding consultation with First Nations people. First Nations people have our own ways of understanding health that protect our communities. In Blackfoot, we start our life and we acknowledge our spirit connecting to our physical beings. As Naitsitapi, we journey over the years in taking care of our spirit in our community in our own ways. In the Western world, this is known as mental health or physical health. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the 2015 TRC calls to action declare in summary that First Nations people have a minimum standard for their continued livelihood and well-being that needs to be met. In addition to the right to health that is self-governed and self-determined as within our treaty agreements. Our healthcare delivery systems need to be rooted in our medicines and natural laws. The healthcare delivery, which includes medical assistance in dying, needs to be directed by First Nations based on First Nations beliefs and understanding and consultation done by First Nations. This is something that was not done to my understanding and in my surveying within the communities. We need to speak to the people who are going to be affected by this directly. And despite having strong cultural roots, First Nations people have higher rates of mental illness and completed suicide than non-First Nations. And as a medical professional who works primarily with First Nations populations, I can attest that depression and anxiety are two of the most prevalent diagnoses in my practices. The amendment of Bill C-7 can potentially put First Nations people at risk for being unfairly influenced by MAID due to the vulnerabilities that are inherent in the community and the lack of healthcare services they can access. As previously stated by Mr. White, First Nations people have the worst health inequities in Canada compared to non-First Nations. Suicide rates in First Nations communities are 10 to 15 times higher than national Canadian average. In some communities, the leading cause of death is suicide in populations under the age of 18. Life expectancy is already 10 to 15 years below the national Canadian average. In the community where I am from, the average age of death was 48 years of age in the last 10 months. And the cause of the death in all these cases was not a natural end, but a lot associated with mental illness and addictions. As First Nations people are burdened with high rates of poverty, chronic disease, and cancer, we need to be aware that we are targeted populations that make us vulnerable on many levels, due to limited access to healthcare, potentially discriminatory healthcare, and lack of priorities for funded healthcare in First Nations. As a physician, each day my role is to do no harm. As doctors, we need to recognize the need for healthcare to support First Nations people. We need to support adequate supports for First Nations health before changing laws that could potentially disproportionately impact First Nations who at this time do not have equitable access to care. If we cannot make access for diagnosis, management, and care, we are not doing just for people who are most vulnerable at this for the amendment of Bill 6. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Potts. And now we will have the Honorable Graydon Nicholas.
Bill C-7 will have devastating consequences in our Indigenous communities. It is a fundamental threat to our way of life because we believe that life comes from our Creator. Our right to self-determination as Indigenous peoples is guaranteed by the United Nations. We want the mental wellness of our people to be our responsibility. We want to promote life for our people, not death. We want all of our people to experience life to the fullest. Suicide in an Indigenous community is tragic. Our youth must be supported to live full and meaningful lives. The loss of one life is too many. It leaves our communities wounded and forever questioning so many what ifs. Our objectives are always to prevent any more deaths by suicide. MAID is not a solution for the illnesses experienced by our people. We want to encourage our people to engage with our elders and seek the spiritual guidance that they desperately need. And I enjoyed the comments of my two colleagues as well. Thank you very much. In my language, Waliwan.
Thank you. Now we will go to Dr. Catherine Ferrier.
I'm a physician with 36 years experience diagnosing, treating, and caring for frail older people, often suffering from Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. I regularly see abused and neglected elderly patients. I often testify in court for abused patients or those whose families are squabbling over powers of attorney and inheritance issues. It's unfortunate that it seems only conservative MPs understand the gravity of the issue that's facing us. It makes it looks like a partisan issue when it's not. It's a question of patient care and safety. A few years ago, there was a story in the papers about a patient of mine who lost her freedom and life savings after a power of attorney, later found to be forged, stripped away her rights without anyone speaking to her or questioning the validity of the power of attorney. Her name was Veronica Piela. You can look up the story. If the false document had been a MAID request, it would have been too late. MAID by advance request is promoted mainly by the white, wealthy, worried well. I can understand that no one wants to lose their cognition, but to promote MAID as the solution reflects ignorance of the many ways in which fragile seniors can be manipulated and abused. Ignorance of the isolation in which many people live, of the ageist and ableist biases against seniors in healthcare and in society. MAID by advance request does not promote autonomy. The decision to implement the directive will be made by a third party who may or may not have the patient's interest at heart and who will interpret and impose some previously expressed wish, ignoring the patient's current wishes. Some say that this is the next step after advance directives refusing care. That is false. The right to refuse medical treatment is based on the right to not be touched without one's consent, and treatment without consent is considered assault. It's not a right to have someone else cause your death. This fear-driven desire for death ignores the many positive aspects of aging, positive evolution in family relationships, as roles are reversed and adult children have an opportunity to pay back the care they received from their parents in the early years of their lives. We often see this in our practices. Unfortunately, not all families respond this way. We also see the abuse that I was talking about. The ultimate abuse being to end a parent's life prematurely through MAID. There are so many better things we could be doing if we really valued our elders. We could make it feasible and affordable to care for aging relatives at home. Replace institutional warehouses with creative new housing models that promote both autonomy and community. There are lots of good ideas out there. It's harder and costs more than MAID, but it would give our elders the respect they deserve. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now we will go to Dr. Felix Pajot.
Bonjour. D'abord, merci aux journalistes d'être présents pour écouter notre conférence, transmettre notre message. Je suis content que le gouvernement ne semble pas vouloir aller dans la direction de promouvoir l'aide médicale à mourir par directive médicale anticipée, mais au Québec, c'est encore une voie qui est assez populaire. Je suis très empathique d'ailleurs au cas de Mme Sandra de Montigny qu'on a vu récemment dans les médias. Je comprends tout à fait la demande. On est dans une société basée sur la performance, les résultats, l'efficacité au travail. C'est bien quand on veut mesurer la richesse d'un pays ou être compétitif par rapport aux autres économies, mais je ne crois pas que c'est une valeur qu'on doit mettre de l'avant pour évaluer la valeur d'une personne, justement. La charge mentale sur nos femmes au Canada, au Québec est forte. Ce sont des femmes qui sont les principales aidantes, soignantes. C'est des femmes fortes au Québec, on le sait. Mais la culpabilité qui peut être associée à cette perte de force, à ne plus être la soignante, à la principale aidante, peut mener au besoin d'être rassuré par la demande d'aide médicale à mourir. Aussi dans une société où on méprise nos aînés, les gens qui se vivent en situation de handicap, qui ont des maladies mentales. Ça peut sembler une solution à mettre de l'avant. On l'a vu durant la COVID, il y a eu beaucoup de personnes qui étaient en situation de handicap, avec des problèmes de santé mentale, qui avaient besoin de soins palliatifs, qui n'ont pas reçu les soins. Il y a eu des coupures dans les dernières années dans notre système de santé. Et je comprends la peur des gens. Mais la solution, c'est pas l'aide médicale à mourir, c'est de revaloriser les soins, de considérer les personnes comme des personnes humaines avec une pleine valeur, en ne se basant pas sur les critères d'efficacité, de travail, mais plutôt sur la valeur réelle qu'ont l'être humain. L'autre aspect, c'est l'autonomie. Au Québec, on aime avoir le choix, décider, être autonome, avoir un choix individuel. Au Canada aussi, c'est important, ces valeurs, mais avec l'aide médicale à mourir par directive médicale anticipée, c'est pas cette valeur-là qui est mise de l'avant. On ne peut pas prévoir à l'avance le type de démence et les symptômes qu'on va avoir, puis le moment où les directives médicales anticipées vont être mises en œuvre. Le problème, c'est qu'en démence, l'autonomie décisionnelle est perdue. C'est la famille et les médecins alors qui sont obligés de décider pour le patient le moment où on va faire les médicaments à mourir. La culpabilité, peut-être compliquée, est une des conséquences de cette décision difficile qu'on imposerait aux familles si on permet l'acte de l'aide médicale à mourir. On ne peut pas prévoir parce qu'il y a 4 types environ de patients. En gériatrie, on a grand type qu'on peut mettre de l'avant. Il y a la démence heureuse, des patients qui vivent très bien les troubles cognitifs sans problème, sans difficulté, anxiété, dépression ou autres symptômes. Aucune souffrance physique ni mentale peut être associée. Il y a bien sûr les symptômes psychologiques et comportementaux de la démence qui peuvent être traitables par une équipe multidisciplinaire spécialisée en gériatrie. Et là, on revient à la case départ. Le patient n'est pas souffrant, il est bien. Donc, on n'aurait pas besoin, même s'il y a une perte d'autonomie fonctionnelle, de faire le médicament à mourir. Le patient est bien. La personne est bien dans sa maladie. C'est certain que parfois, on n'arrive pas à traiter, mais là, les équipes de 2e ligne, 3e ligne, spécialisées, il faut financer notre système. La solution, c'est de donner des soins empathiques et suffisants pour traiter ce qui est les troubles de comportement, l'errance, puis redonner la valeur aux gens qui vivent en situation de handicap. C'est vraiment le message que je veux laisser aujourd'hui. Comme on vaccine de plus en plus les gens en CHD pour le COVID, on a réalisé que nos aînés sont importants grâce à la pandémie. Malheureusement, il y a plusieurs effets secondaires, mais un des effets bénéfiques, c'est de réaliser à quel point on tient à nos aînés. Puis en gériatrie, on est prêt, avec nos équipes multidisciplinaires, à les soigner, à s'en occuper. Puis comme je dis, je comprends la vision de Mme de Montigny et de tous ceux qui appuient cette idée. Mais ce qui est important, c'est de revoir le patient comme une personne humaine qu'on peut protéger, qu'on peut soigner, qu'on peut traiter. L'important, c'est que le gouvernement nous donne les moyens de faire notre travail. Merci.
Thank you so much. And now I'm hoping that we're going to go to Dr. Bertrand Major, but I can't see him on the line.
Je suis présent. M'entendez-vous?
Yes, thank you.
Je m'appelle Bertrand Major. Je suis un médecin psychiatre. Je travaille depuis une trentaine d'années en tant que psychiatre. Je travaille dans un hôpital, un gros hôpital général en périphérie de Montréal. Par ces amendements à la loi C7, incluant les patients souffrant de troubles mentaux, on veut faire croire que chez nos malades, le désir de mourir est un choix rationnel. Ce n'est pas vrai. Le désir de mourir chez nos patients en santé mentale manifeste un symptôme, et un symptôme très souvent transitoire, surtout si on prend soin de façon compétente du patient. La personne qui se suicide, et les statistiques le confirment, plus souvent qu'autrement, elle n'a pas été prise en charge. Certains patients peuvent, il est vrai, souffrir d'idées suicidaires chroniques. Encore une fois, par un traitement adapté, avec du temps et un espoir renouvelé, les patients s'améliorent et la vie reprend son cours. Les psychiatres connaissent ces problématiques. Nous sommes formés pour aider ces patients. Aider quelqu'un à reprendre goût à la vie, ce n'est pas entraver sa liberté, ni de la discrimination. La vraie discrimination, c'est aider quelqu'un à mourir quand il aurait pu, par un traitement judicieux, vivre encore de nombreuses années, d'une vie maintenant riche de sens. Revivre après avoir souffert, quel cadeau. Cela dit, il est vrai que certains de nos malades sont très atteints par leur pathologie. Mais avec de bons soins, quelqu'un pas trop loin qui nous aime, le désir de mort n'est pas là. Malgré une atteinte grave, tout demeure possible. C'est comme ça dans le domaine de la psychiatrie. Voilà pourquoi l'inclusion des troubles mentaux demeure et demeurera controversée. Si par malheur, nos patients reçoivent l'aide à mourir, le Canada rejoindra la Belgique et les Pays-Bas, où cela se fait depuis près de 20 ans. Il y a eu progression nette du nombre de gens qui sont morts de cette façon, et souvent pour des pathologies qui auraient pu être traitées. Sachez-le, beaucoup ont reçu l'aide médicale à mourir, non parce qu'ils étaient très malades, mais parce qu'ils étaient seuls. Un exemple. Une dame qui vit seule. Elle souffre d'une déficience intellectuelle légère et elle se plaint d'acouphènes. Elle est trop sensible à ce qu'elle entend. Elle veut l'aide médicale à mourir. Premier examen médical, refusé. Deuxième examen médical, elle est acceptée. Décédée après 10 jours. Qu'en pensez-vous? Ces pays ont mis en place sur le papier des comités de surveillance. Mais dans les faits, ces comités ne jouent pas leur rôle. Et les pratiques d'euthanasie, même douteuses, se font en toute impunité. Pensez-vous que cela sera différent ici, que nous serons différents? Permettez-moi d'en douter. Non, vraiment, la prudence élémentaire nous commande de reculer. Le suicide ne doit pas devenir une option. Sinon, la vie et la mort deviendront banales. Mesdames et messieurs, nos élus de toute allégeance, pensez-y bien.
Thank you so much. Not least, we have Dr. John Mayer.
Thank you. Suicide on demand must not become the law of the land. Most Canadians are unaware of this artificially pressured push to pass Bill C7. It's happening under the cover of COVID when Canadians are struggling with a pandemic that has worsened social disparity and pushed many to the depths of hopelessness. This issue does transcend partisan politics. How can any human being in good conscience ignore the loud cries of hundreds of disability organizations, mental health organizations, medical associations, Indigenous peoples, religious organizations, the United Nations, and our citizens who know the wounds inflicted by racism, ageism, and ableism? I'm currently president of the association representing the 80 ACT teams in Ontario who care for the sickest and most vulnerable. As an association, we oppose MAID for mental illness. Offering death to people who are impoverished, undertreated, and suicidal is discriminatory. Suicide is taking steps to cause your own death, whatever the steps. MAID for non-terminal illness is suicide using a sanitized gun in a white coat. Terminal illness means sure death and no hope. Mental illness means no death and sustaining hope. Having just a few months to live is very different than having 60 years to live. Determining whether a particular psychiatric disease is irremediable is impossible. People can take many months or a number of years to recover. What is 100% certain is that this legislation will absolutely cause the deaths of people who would have recovered and lived long lives. Offering suicide because effective treatment is unavailable is indefensible. Inadequate care causes treatable illnesses to appear untreatable. Offering MAID as a solution to the underfunding of mental health care in Canada is sickening hypocrisy. As we speak, 6,000 people in Ontario are waiting up to 5 years to get the specialty care that my team provides. In the meantime, they're in and out of the hospital, getting Band-Aids on deep wounds and not healing. This is systemic stigmatization and discrimination. Clinical relationships are already being profoundly undermined. My patients are saying to me, why try to recover when MAID is coming and I will be able to choose death? When the parents of a young woman asked me if I was going to help their daughter get better or kill her, the moral perversion of all of this couldn't have been clearer to me. Canada offers MAID, but not universal palliative care, disability supports, or mental health care. Do we congratulate ourselves for our compassion in giving people an easier way to die while depriving them of the resources they need to live? Is this what free choice looks like in Canada? Thank you.
And that was all of our speakers, so I pass it back to the moderator.
Okay, thank you to all the participants. Merci aux participants. We'll now start the question period. Nous allons maintenant commencer la période des questions. As usual, one question, one follow-up. We have time for 6 questions today. We'll start with 3 questions on the phone before turning to the room. Comme d'habitude, une question et une question de suivi. Nous avons le temps pour 6 questions aujourd'hui. Nous allons commencer avec 3 questions au téléphone avant d'en prendre dans la salle. Please identify yourself before asking your question. S'il vous plaît, identifiez-vous avant de poser votre question. Opérateur, pouvons-nous avoir la première question sur le téléphone? Operator, could we have the first question on the phone?
Thank you. Merci. We will now take questions, yes, from the telephone lines. If you have a question and you're using a speakerphone, please lift your handset before making your selection. If you have a question, please press *1 on your device's keypad. There will be a brief pause while the participants register. We thank you for your patience. Merci. Nous allons maintenant passer à la période de questions. Si vous utilisez un téléphone main libre, s'il vous plaît, soulevez le combiné avant d'effectuer votre sélection. Si vous désirez poser une question, veuillez s'il vous plaît appuyer sur les touches étoile 1 de votre appareil. Il y aura un court délai vous permettant de vous enregistrer dans la file d'attente pour la période de questions. Merci. Once again, please press *1 on your telephone keypad if you have a question. De nouveau, faites étoile 1 sur votre appareil pour toute question.
Okay, there doesn't seem to be any questions, so this concludes the press conference. Thank you. Ceci met fin à la conférence de presse. Merci.